All right, peoples, tell me when we're ready to go. Are you ready to go? Everybody ready? Sorry to keep you all waiting and a late start, but people seem to be enjoying their conversations, so...
Can we have a round of applause for you all coming together?
Nice to see old faces and new faces today. I won't do a massive introduction because I will be accused of stealing the speech. So all I'm going to say is thank you to Ranjit for preparing today's presentation. And essentially, quite recently we did a meeting on immigration because we were relaunching our party's immigration pamphlet when we printed the second edition. It's a topic that comes round and round and round again because it really is a topic of vital importance to understand for the working class struggle what its real significance is and how it's used. But recently we saw in the summer riots in some cities in Britain, and it was presented as, Britain's descending into a race war. But really we wanted to look again at how the question of immigration is used and misused for ruling class agendas that are hidden behind a rhetoric of fighting racism or, protecting ordinary people, protecting minorities, preventing hate speech. So I'm going to leave it there and hand you over to Ranjit for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jyoti. Preparation in one sense is a strong term. I thought about laying out slides and making something very audio-visually exciting for you, but there's a sense in which it's not necessary. And it's not necessary in a sense because I'm going to draw on work which is very familiar to me, and I hope familiar to many of you, because it is in a very real sense the bread and butter daily work of the party and our organisation. If I were to show you the August-September issue of Proletarian, and you can see the headline that says Labour means racism, repression and war. And there are certain people, in our country who still vote Labour, though as we see, if you look inside, and please do get hold of an issue, and if you look inside the front cover, you'll see actually Labour landslide election narrative hides deepening crisis of legitimacy, because it doesn't take a lot of probing to see that electoral turnout in our country is falling. There's a lack of engagement in our so-called democratic process and a lack of faith in the mainstream parties. And what there definitely was an incredible crisis of confidence in the Conservative administration. But it wasn't just the Conservative administration, it was the entire apparatus of bourgeois democracy in our country, and that includes all the mainstream parties, including Labour Party. And a great deal of political engineering had to happen to manufacture an apparent Labour landslide in seats, which when you look at it, covered perhaps at most 18% of the voting age adult population who actually voted in this Labour administration. And they are continuing, as we predicted they would in the run-up, and as we've done a lot of work on the nature of the Labour Party. Got this fantastic book, which I'm going to refer you to again, and I gave a separate presentation, and I won't recapitulate that, on Britain's perfidious Labour Party. And, we've got Clement Attlee here, the famous post-war Labour leader, right up to the current incumbent Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. And what's not absolutely understood is that they're of the same mould, and that the party has continued with its function as essentially being a solid, loyal British opposition, a loyal party of British imperialism throughout its history. And that's whether you look at its role in the colonies or its role domestically in pursuing a heavily, vigorously anti-communist policy, a vigorously anti-trade union and organised labour policy, of suppressing the working class when it comes to the general strike of 1926, of suppressing the working class when it comes to the miners' strike of 1984, of enacting and keeping Tory legislation. We've seen that already since they've come in. It's such a familiar pattern to me now, and it will be to anyone who's lived through the past Blair administration. They come in and they say, well, the economic realities are such, and they just carry on with the same persecution of the working class on behalf of finance capital, sometimes even more vigorously than the previous Tory party. It always used to amaze me that Tony Blair could go to the teachers' union, promise them nothing, tell them they're going to have hard times, they're going to have more of the same, more privatization, more ASBOs, more persecution of the poor, you know. But then he can say education, 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 and get a standing ovation. And the trades unions and the Trades Union Congress will absolutely do the dirty work of suppressing strikes, suppressing industrial action, and saying we've got to get behind this Labour administration for as long as possible. And they're already doing the same thing. We just recently had a Trades Union Congress at which they haven't done anything to overturn their position of support for the prosecution of the war in Ukraine and imperialist policies. They made some very soft noises about Palestine without any real substance. And again, it's suppression of activity. We have members who are, maybe I shouldn't say, affiliated and working within the Trades Union Congress. And it's made absolutely clear to them. You know, these are people who are working class in Britain's trade union movement, working for the administration of the trade union movement. It's made absolutely clear to them there's a three-line whip. They are not allowed any independent political thought or activity that exceeds the bounds of what is allowable by the Labour Party. And in that way, you know, the CPB, a rival Communist Party, make a lot of play of the fact that the Labour Party is the mass party of the working class because of its link to the trade unions. But we must learn to see that this is it's a means of policing the trade unions and the working class. That the link goes both ways, but it's overall the political elite of the Labour Party who are in control. And they use the trades union apparatus to regulate and keep the working class in check. And it's within that framework that we have to examine what's been happening in our country. It's only been 2.5 months, 10 weeks of Labour Party administration. And I remember a speech by Tariq Ali in which he made great play of examining the new Obama administration and what they'd done, as if you can expect a new thing from a democratic institution. But perhaps it is a good time to have take a little stock of the course of events so far. Just 10 weeks of this new Labour Party administration. And I can tell you that the Trades Union Congress and bureaucracies are, they're cock-a-hoop, basically. They're very self-congratulatory that they've got their Labour administration because all of their activity, constantly drives towards one thing, which is to get a Labour Party administration. That's the limit of their desired political outcome and activity. So we must always remember that. And our party has a very good critique of the trade union movement and a real programme that we need to think about putting forward in the trade union movement. And I'll signpost that to you as well, which is a manifesto for the crisis. Because these are the real measures that we need to put forward as an immediate first aid programme to a working class who are suffering a real cost of living crisis, but also pointing towards a more long-term programme of how we can actually empower workers to start to make inroads into the political dictatorship of capital and create an environment where they can seriously think about socialism. Perhaps the immediate thing that triggered this, this presentation, the idea that we should revisit the question of immigration. And again, a party has a long history of looking at this issue. Our party is not afraid to tackle the difficult issues that are facing the working class, which are divisive and used to control the working class, at looking at the arguments in a many-sided way and coming up with practical programs, solutions, and ideas. We do say that there is a line that the working class should take. The immediate stimulus for this meeting was the events of 25th of July. So it's just 2-3 weeks into the new Labour administration. And there were apparently a series of riots which seemed to dominate the entire media narrative up and down the country, which were pogroms and were race riots. And they were triggered by a very unfortunate and sad incident of some young children who were stabbed to death by someone who was mentally unstable. I believe that person turned out to be from Rwanda, and we don't know the horrors that that person witnessed in Rwanda, a country which just one administration ago, was it really only 3 months ago, that we were being told for 2 years the best thing we could possibly do with asylum seekers was to deport them all to Rwanda, because this was a stable place, we were told. Rwanda that knew a genocide in our lifetime, and whose current incumbent Prime Minister, Paul Kagame, is a darling of the West precisely because he cooperates with them in their geostrategic terms, in the domination and extraction of mineral resources from East Africa, in particular the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. So we were told this was going to be the answer. Labour seemed to have scrapped that policy, and no longer do all of our headlines every day scream about the necessity of deporting everyone to Rwanda. But what's definitely the case is Labour Party have been part of this bidding war around the election, before the election, since the election, saying that one of the great problems facing British working people and the crisis of living is due to immigration, due to immigrants. And it's very hard to draw the line between one group of immigrants and another. The implication is just everyone non-white who's not been living here for 20 generations. So all of us are affected by this, because Britain is a country that's had a huge history of immigration. And actually, it's something that's been the relatively progressive features of capitalism. So we have to ask ourselves, what is immigration? Where does it come from? Who does it affect? Is it a problem? If it's a problem, what's the solution? If it's not a problem, what's the solution? Because it's something that dominates our life. These riots happen throughout the country, in Southport, in the Merseyside area, in the northeast, in Yorkshire, in Rotherham. You know, I think many of you will have seen the pictures televised from the Holiday Inn in Rotherham, just around the corner from a hospital where I used to work, in a community that's basically prides itself on being full of miners and steel workers and the salt of the working class and the salt of the earth. And to be honest, they're quite, God's own Yorkshiremen. People are very proud to be from Yorkshire, and they're proud of their working class heritage. And it's been a privilege to know and work with those people. But it's unquestionably the case that, again, it's a centre of immigration. Traditionally, there's been a large Pakistani community who've come to areas of Yorkshire, Rotherham and Sheffield in particular, to work in the steel industry, to work in heavy mines and manufacturing when that was there. Just as in Southall, where we are today, there were huge influx of Punjabi immigrants, economic immigrants, who were invited to come in after World War II and work factories, work for Wolf's Rubber Factory as it was here. But it's a similar story up and down the country, and you'll find centres of people who are drawn from the colonies to work. And that's normal. So I'm going to suggest to you that immigration, movement of population migration, was anyway a feature of humanity from the earliest days of time. If you think that, evolutionarily speaking, mankind is largely evolved in the eastern part of Africa, Rift Valley is the earliest places that we found human beings. And African continent has the most genetic diversity, but this is probably the cradle of civilization and humanity. That's true. And beyond that, as man then spread out, and man spread out following what? Following herds, following hunting and gathering. So mankind has known economic migration since the earliest days of humanity. That's economic migration. You follow the herds, you follow the wildebeest, you follow the crops, you follow the environments. When mankind learned to navigate the rivers, you follow the rivers and you follow the coastline. And it was through this method that the humanity, as a successful species, has covered the face of the earth. This is something that presumably we're all familiar with. Then there have been further developments, and probably around 13, 14, 15,000 years ago in various places, certainly in China, certainly in Mesopotamia, between the Nile, between the Euphrates and the Tigris in this area of Mesopotamia. We started to have the elements of domestication of cattle and the rearing of agricultural crops, beans, wheat, peas, and rice in China. So these crops then became the whole basis of a new level of civilization. And without going into it, you can look at Engels' Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State. You can look at Jared Diamond's guns, germs and steel, and you can get a sense of the way in which that increased regularity of nutrition, the increased productivity of labour, brought together more densely populated areas and cities even. And on the basis of those densely populated areas, society became more variegated. Classes started to emerge. There became ruling classes and oppressed classes, working classes. This had a progressive content. Science started to flourish, and hence the steel, hence the germs, hence all of the things that made it possible for one world that became more developed to start to colonize other areas of the world. I won't go into all of that history now, but this clearly has led to modern society. Modern society, capitalist society, is based on the exploitation of man by man and nation by nation. And within that, it's very clear that the old imperial centers, those centers of empire, started to have, for many centuries now, commercial, first of all commercial, trading, and later direct ruling relations with vast swathes of the world. Britain, 400 years ago, granted license to people to set up the East India Company. It was Queen Elizabeth I did it in 1600. So for that period of time, we've been having steady intercourse, exchange of goods, exchange of products, exchange of people. That developed into more and more exploitative relationship. And I won't go into the whole history of company rule in India or the slave trade, but it's quite clear that those initial relations of trade became relations of domination and subjugation. And Britain had an empire on which the sun never set, and was proud of the fact. As a result of that, it drew wealth from all over the world. And after the Second World War, when the home economy was in ruin, when the economy of the world was in ruin, Britain went out and deliberately invited, people from all over the colony to come and rebuild the empire. Interestingly, this isn't a phenomenon only seen in Britain. It's seen in every imperialist country. The United States is an entire country built on genocide of the native population and immigration, wave after wave of immigration. It's always strange when I hear Trump talking about building a wall to keep the immigrants out. I'm like, well, which one? In America, Lenin used to describe New York as a machine for pressing immigrants into Americans, right? You don't have to look very far back to see the Spanish conquest of America. If you actually looked at the real history of that, to see some of the atrocities committed against the native population. But immigration was absolutely a phenomenon of the Americans. It's a phenomenon of all imperialism. Russia, interestingly, though it was the Tsarist empire, had its colonies that were contiguous with Mother Russia. They were kind of an economic integral whole rather than distributed piecemeal around the world. Was a colonial center, and again saw just that, saw a very varied mix of races, peoples, cultures in its capital. This is a feature of humanity. So then where does the problem arise? I'll just read very quickly what Lenin said. It says, capitalism has given rise to a special form of migration. The rapidly developing industrial countries attract workers from the backward countries through a combination of higher wages in the advanced capitalist countries and destitution in the backward countries. There can be no doubt that dire poverty alone compels people to abandon their native land, and that capitalists exploit the immigrant workers in the most shameless manner. He went on to say that only reactionaries can shut their eyes to the progressive significance of this modern migration of nations, which draws the masses of the working people of the whole world into the arena of class struggle by breaking down the musty, fusty habits of local life, breaking down national barriers and prejudices, uniting workers from all countries in huge factories and mines in America, Germany, and so forth. So you see, side by side, the reactionary, the breaking of the old, the terrible distress that's caused to people, but equally the forging of new economic relations, the more and more changing the world into two great camps of people, an incredibly moneyed group of imperialists, and there's no barrier to the export of capital, no barrier for them to go around the world and find conditions to extract minerals, extract oil, extract coltan, extract lithium from mines, that they'll coup countries in order to take resources at the lowest possible value, to have domination over the cheap labor, to use the Bangladeshi workers to make them, make products for Walmart, and we see their factories collapsing on them in kind of really Dickensian conditions. So capital can do all of these things. And wealth, of course, then, is drawn to the centres of imperialism. And what happens to those countries which are trying to be kept in a deindustrialized state? They have a natural desire of their people to find better economic conditions. So that migration will follow. It's a bit like osmosis. You know, you're concentrating wealth in a few hands in a few nations, and a few nations where they've learnt that if they alleviate the conditions of the workers slightly, create better conditions of life, they can have more stable base for them to exploit the whole world. And that's the basis of our relative privilege in Britain. But all this wealth in these few countries, and then you've got poverty everywhere else. And then is it surprising that there's a constant, like almost osmotic flow of the population following the wealth, following the better conditions? And we must never be drawn into this concept that we must condemn economic migration like it's some kind of terrible thing, not real migration. It's not real refugees running away from oppression. They're running away from dire poverty, destitution, life made impossible. And it's made impossible because of the looting of imperialism. We must always remember that. And then coupled with that, you have those nations trying to develop themselves, trying to break free of the poverty trap, trying to have industry, trying to say, well, here we are in Venezuela. We're actually sitting on the world's greatest reserve of oil. Why can't we nationalize the oil? Why can't we use all this wealth for our own people, raise the conditions of life, industrialize ourselves, take wealth back into the hands of the people? No, we can't do this. You absolutely can't do this. I had a comrade recently join us who's of Grenadian origin. No, I'm so sorry. He's from Guyana. Sorry, he's of Guyanan origin. And he said he'd worked in the financial sector for some time. And he went to an interview once and he was outraged when he was told Guyana was a poor country and he had to hold it inside. But he says it's disgusting to him. Guyana, again, is floating on oil. And they have a contract, a national contract with Exxon. Exxon, which is one of the descendants of the Rockefeller Standard Oil Company. And the contract is, no problem, we'll make a deal. We'll come and run your oil fields for you, and we'll have a national split between the company and Guyana. And any ideas kind of roughly what that split might be?
Not very good.
I don't know.
93.7.
93.7. Anyone else? 95.5. So 99. So 99.1 is actually the deal. So the country, the whole of the people of Guyana get 1% of the oil wealth, and Exxon get 99%. And now, can you imagine why, when Chedi Chagan or some successor came into the government and wanted to change those relations, you'll see why these people are toppled. And so when Chavez is there and wants to use the oil of Venezuela, you know, everyone's seen recently Trump's talking, he's talking, he's going, Venezuelan oil, we're buying oil from Venezuela. He's like outraged, we're buying oil from Venezuela.
It's ours.
You should have left me in charge. If you left me in charge, we'd have had that oil. It's our, it's our oil. It belongs to us. This is their attitude to the world.
So he wanted to take that 1%.
1%, absolutely. So the bottom line is, this is the relationship imperialism wants with the world. They impoverish the mass of the world, they concentrate wealth, and is it a wonder that you get a constant flow, a pressure of people who want to escape poverty by chasing the wealth? Like, this is something unnatural. It's not, is it? But in our country, you get another phenomenon. So since Thatcher, since Reagan, they have made a very deliberate decision that we are huge finance capitalists, and we've got old industry, which is relatively unproductive and uncompetitive, and we've got a big militant working class who are a problem. We're having all these strikes, they're getting rid of our governments. Wouldn't it be much better to tackle the workers head on? We had the embarrassment of the Heath government falling, and now Thatcher came to power with a very clear mandate: prepare for war and crush the miners. Crush the miners, close down the mines, close down the energy, close down uncompetitive industry. And she did it. We won't talk about all the ways she did it. She did it with full complicity of Kinnock. She did full complicity of the leadership of the Labour Party and the Labour Party. Full complicity of the Trades Union Congress, who refused to come out in solidarity. So they closed down the miners. It doesn't matter that energy became more expensive and more expensive and more expensive. It didn't matter. You've dealt with the problem. Because why? Because we're a finance capitalist country. The city of London became the sole dominating factor. There was almost no industrial capital. So they realized export capital. You can have workers abroad who still work like the Bangladeshi workers in Rana Plaza, where they can't complain, and if they complain, they can be sacked or semi-murdered or pushed out, you know, and their trade unions are routinely have the police set on them, so they're subject to great violence. And factory owners are so complacent they don't worry even when their buildings are falling down, and when their buildings fall down, you just quietly sweep them away, set up new ones, and Walmart profits carry on flowing. Why? Isn't it much better? Isn't it much better? You know, we read Capital recently. You look at the conditions of the working class as the working class and capitalism was being forged in this country, and you think, oh, we're glad that doesn't exist anymore. That exists. It exists everywhere, all over the world. It exists everywhere, all over the world. And it's to keep that system in place that all of our political establishment is set up. But what did it mean here? It meant that when I went to Rotherham, when you go to Southport, when you go to where George Galloway recently won his electoral victory. God, again, seems like another era, doesn't it? In Rochdale. When you go to these areas that used to be full of mines and mills and steelworks and textile manufacturers, and these people used to be the workshop of the world, well, they're not anymore. And they're surplus to requirements. And they're kept at a certain level of low-level existence, you know? If you see the actual, population who are in work in this country, it's about 25, 30 million. So you can see the numbers who are not in work are underemployed and are kept alive by a very meagre benefit system. It's a miserable life. And their communities are shut down. If you go to those former pit villages, you got intravenous drug use and PlayStation seem to be the main occupation of a huge swathe of the population. It's pretty it's a slight caricature, but it's a real phenomenon, you know. So we're wasted lives, unfulfilled lives in communities that are shattered and broken, spread all around the country, whether you go to South Wales, Merthyr Tydfil, or whether you go to Stockport. And then what happens? So they're just about kept alive. They're being told, this fad to this fad, hobbyism, low level, education's poor, NHS is poor. Oh, life's getting more and more expensive. Conditions are going down and down. They can't afford to move out. They can't afford houses. And then to keep the system in place, we have to fight wars. Wars against the people who threaten periodically to take away the superabundant, cheap resources on which the entire international system rests. The Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the Libya War, the Syria War, the Yemen War. You can keep on naming them. Somalia. Destabilization throughout the whole of South America. Every government which strives to change the resistance, to deprive imperialism of the right to freely penetrate, exploit workers on their lowest possible wages and the best terms for capital, to loot the nation. Anyone who opposes that in any way becomes persona non grata and they get rid of. Saddam Hussein wasn't some great revolutionary. He was their stooge that they used to batter Iran in the Iran-Iraq war for years. It's taken years for the Iraqi people and the Iranian people to look at each other, having had millions of people who suffered death in their hands, who had the British pumping chemical weapons to Saddam, not to use against the Marsh Arabs, to use against the Iranians. During the Iran war, they propped him up until he finally said, hang on, we're not getting a very good deal on our oil. And Kuwait is being used to undercut the prices of our oil. And he even got the green light. They realized by this point he was unstable. Get the green light, go and invade Kuwait. And then this huge armada came to destroy the country. Iraq, I still meet Iraqis. I feel ashamed when I meet them. My fellow professor at my old university, a professor who, incidentally, when I was arrested at that Palestine demo, literally came to me in the corridor and embraced me and hugged me and said, thank you for what you've done. I've done nothing. But our country has taken this country and pounded it into the dirt. From being one of the most developed, had a country which would have had more civilization, better average standard of life than, I'm pointing to you, Christina, because it's Southern Europe. It would be better than Greece, Portugal, Spain, had a higher standard of living. The dinar that they had, the gold dinar was worth like £4. It was such a strong economy and currency. But because they wanted not to be super exploited, Saddam had to go, war had to be fought, we had to destroy the area. We've laid the entire, Iraq full of depleted uranium. People came back with Gulf War syndrome. We still talk about it we don't know why they got that. That was weird, wasn't it? They've all been handling radioactive depleted uranium shells, munitions on the ground where it was fired. People don't even print. I have a British medical journal. Occasionally we'll have some article. They'll talk about various research on various topics. It's all very high-powered journal, but the really big issues that face humanity, they pretend they're not there. They pretend they're not there. I can't remember reading an article in the British Medical Journal talking about the birth defects and the incidence of cancer in the countries where they've used depleted uranium. They just conveniently just brush this. It's like impolite to talk about it, like talking about private education, at a middle-class dinner party. Very, very unpopular, controversial thing to talk about. So this is imperialism. So obviously in these acts of wars, these relentless wars, millions of people are killed, tens of millions are ejected from their place where they were comfortably living their secure and productive lives. We know that the Syrian war, it's not even called a war. Not even called a war. Do you remember the pictures of Hillary Clinton and Haig and the Saudi, monarchy all shaking hands and doing their deals and putting in forward this new, we'll call it the Libyan Free Army or whatever, and we're going to have a new government that will set up in exile, and Assad must go. Remember Assad must go?
Yeah.
Assad must go. Assad must go. Assad must go. 10 million people have been displaced from Syria during that time. Where are they going to go? They're going to go wherever they can make a life. And of course, when millions of people are displaced, many of them are going to end up in the centres, the most wealthy centres. And people have been traumatized by seeing the horrors of war and displacement. Are not all going to be incredibly happy, functional human beings when they land wherever they land. None of those things are difficult to understand. So inevitably, when certain numbers do make it to Britain or other parts of Europe or United States or Australia or whatever little havens are designated as what Putin quite rightly is called the golden billion, the places which have been marked out as these are the mainly Anglo-Saxon places that are going to be the beneficiaries of exploiting the whole world. When they make into those territories and they're dysfunctional and they're temporarily poor, and then there are laws which repress them, and they put in little hotels and houses where they're not allowed to work and they're not allowed to make a life or make a contribution. I mean, don't forget, human beings are incredibly productive. And we live in a society under capitalism which has this absurd contradiction that we are awash with the goods and the productivity of industry to the extent that to keep it profitable and to keep it functioning as capital, i.e. the capitalist has to make a profit from the whole process, because he impoverishes so many people, puts so many people out of work in this process of productivity and making so many cheap goods. They're so impoverished that the ultimate consumer, which is the mass of humanity, can't afford to buy the goods that are produced by the incredible productivity. It's an absurd system. So we have a famine of want amidst this sea of plenty. And that's the contradiction we're constantly dealing with. We have this crisis of overproduction. This is the fundamental problem. So British workers who've had their lives deindustrialized to feed this crazy system of imperialism and are now unhappy that their conditions of life are getting worse and worse and their communities are broken and they don't have the jobs that they used to have. Or the American middle class, so-called, no longer really exists. The distribution of wealth is so extreme from one pole of the billionaires to the massive workers. They're unhappy. They're getting these displaced workers who are the real much worse off victims of this imperialist system, some of whom make it back to Britain. But they're obviously different. They speak different languages, they've got different colours, they've got different, it takes a generation to integrate, to learn the language, to build a life, all those things. They're forbidden from integrating. They're called out as the problem. And what does Keir Starmer say at his election rally? Firstly, he goes to speak to the sun and say how this is proclaimed as a great advance. We're back speaking to the sun, when there's a reason that this mass of the Labour movement hated the Sun. They hated it because of the Sheffield Wednesday Liverpool football disaster at their stadium, Hillsborough, and the way that workers were treated. They hate it because of every industrial dispute that workers ever get into. They actually suddenly see the level of lies and vitriol and propaganda directed at them, particularly the miners' strike. They still remember 40 years later, when you go to mining villages, they remember the way they were treated, the way they were outcast, old King Coal, the Labour dictator Scargill, and all of this, the propaganda that they directed against Libya and Gaddafi, they suddenly find directed against themselves. But what we never seem to learn in our country is that this is generalized propaganda of imperialism. They lie about everything. Everything. When workers feel it against themselves for a moment, they're so outraged that, we'll never buy a Murdoch paper. Well done, don't buy a Murdoch paper. Just watch the BBC, or watch ITV, or watch Fox News. It's a monopoly of media information. We were talking earlier before the meeting. I barely turn on the TV. I don't look at it. I occasionally reference it just to see if they're saying anything that resembles the truth, and I very quickly find out they're not. This is a weapon. Lolcar is a weapon. This is the latest one, and what's not mentioned in these narratives. Or maybe before I move on, there's Starmer. There's Starmer talking to the Sun. And he's being asked, of course, about the hot topic of the day because they want to put Starmer in. So about immigration, and he goes, look, I've done it before. Like Bangladeshis, I can remove the Bangladeshis. I've done it before, and I can do it again. Like Bangladeshis, I don't know if he had a slip of the mind, because Bangladeshis have been here a long time, and they're a very stable community. And I'm sure he goes to have his curry in the East End of London, like everyone else. And there'd be no restaurant trade in Britain without the Bangladeshis for a start. And they're well-integrated community. You can find doctors, lawyers, why would you attack the Indians? God, I think you're meant to be attacking the Muslims. Did you just... It's fine, everyone's allowed to attack. But for whatever reason. But the bottom line is he was very happy to be wheeled out to give anti-immigrant rhetoric. And it's not a surprise. My father was... a leader of the Indian Workers Association, Indian community. And they lived in a time when racism was much more rampant. For all that they had these little show pogroms and sent a signal, it was a signal that was designed, one, to encourage repression, two, to enact more draconian legislation. And that draconian legislation really is not going to be aimed at this allegedly right-wing working class. Clearly they had agents who stoked these pogroms. Clearly the Yaxley Lennons, the FLA, all these people, they get funding, they get the nod and the wink. It's a helpful current, It's the sign of every dying regime is that it stokes pogroms. We said it at the time of the collapse of the Tsar in 1907 and 1905, 1907, 1917. Pogroms were the order of the day. You go around, you stir up one section of the population against another. You see in India, every time they have election, they'll put Hindu against Muslim. In north of Ireland, they'll send Catholic against Protestant. And quite clearly, there's a big drive to push that message at the moment. With the workers' class lives being so bad, if you can set them against each other, it helps you to keep them all down, suppress their discontent, and push your repressive legislation. That's clearly happening. But... where was I?
Measures they were doing at Labour being anti-immigrant. The measures they're bringing in.
Bangladeshis, yeah. But I was going to say here, Labour have a long history of anti-immigrant action. And if you go back to my father, Pal Bra, was a member of and a leader of the Indian Workers Association. And I think it was 1979, which was the election that brought Thatcher to power.
That's right.
And at the time, we had the National Front. It was pre-BNP days. National Front were proper fascists. And they had a real thing that they encouraged Paki bashing. And they went out into the streets and killed people and stabbed people and beat them to death. And many of us may have met them and had interaction with them. And interestingly, I grew up in Hemel Hempstead, which I later found out was the national headquarters of the National Front. So it kind of puts in perspective why suddenly all my friends suddenly became racists at a certain age. So why have you all become racists? What happened? 1 minute you're playing and the next minute you're racist. It took me a while to figure it out, but...
some of our teachers were a bit funny.
Yeah, they were, definitely were, yeah. Yeah, Mr. Cracknell, if you're out there. I haven't forgotten. So there's this phenomenon, right? So they were much more serious racists, and of course it was built on the background of British imperial racism. So, if you go out and exploit the whole world, you need an ideology that goes with it. And that ideology basically is racism. It's the trying to divide the working class and use your local domestic population and tell them, yes, you don't tell them, you're our servants and we're going to use you to repress the other workers. You tell them you're a superior race and we have to go out and beat the natives and beat them into position. And then they'll fulfill administrative and policing roles and army roles, suppressing people all over the world. And if you go back and look at the old history of the Yemeni colonial war or any colonial war, you'll see the atrocities that were committed under that doctrine. But so it's much worse here. When my father came here in 1962, there was much more serious racism, which is why I think he got drawn in. A big part of the reason why he got drawn in to the whole of his political struggle and his community activism. It's why we're in Southall. It's our long history with the Indian Workers Association. But here in 1979, in this election that brought Thatcher to power, I think it was James Callaghan was the Labour Prime Minister at the time who was outgoing. And the National Front used this election to provocatively hold an election rally in Southall, like they're going to ask the Sikh community to vote National Front. They just did it as a provocation, using it so they could just have an openly anti-immigrant, racist rally in the middle of Southall. It's like sending a nail bomb into Southall. It's their equivalent, right, politically. So, and what happened? The local population were outraged. Big demonstration was ordered to prevent them from having this racist rally. The police turned up, and then they were called the Special Patrol Group. They've now become something different. Territorial Support Group, but it's the same group. And they turned up, and it turns out the police themselves were quite fascistic. Surprise, surprise. They had open racists within that group. They had special powers to beat and suppress demonstrations. Turned out that they'd actually been boring their truncheons and filling them with lead to make them more lethal weapons. And in the process of trying to break the bones and crack the skulls, they killed a New Zealand teacher, Blair Peach. Do you remember Blair Peach? He is still remembered in this community. But this was a Labour government that sent the police, racist police, to beat and kill, as it turns out, anti-racist demonstrators, to allow fascists to parade in Southall under the aegis of
democracy.
A democratic process of just basically making immigrants feel unhappy and uncomfortable. So our country has a long history of racism. That's part of colonialism, but the Labour Party has a long history of promoting it. So it doesn't just come out of nowhere. It comes out of everything they do, and it comes out of the colonial wars they incessantly fight. If you're going to mobilize the people to fight wars in the Middle East to steal their oil, it's not good to go and say, we want to steal all their stuff. People think, oh, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. We're good Christians, aren't we? We're civilized. Not like No, much better to say they're Islamists, they're jihadis, they're terrorists, they're uncivilized, they're barbarians, and it's about protecting the rights of ethnic minorities within those countries and delivering democracy from 3,000 feet in the air using your cruise missiles, your bombs, your Tomahawk cruise missiles. So it's the total hypocrisy. It's the divorce between the words and the deeds. So that racism becomes incredibly useful. And really, if you want to look, and I can tell you that any Muslim, any Arab, any African who comes to this country still feels, particularly Muslims, they feel a level of vituperation, racism, insecurity, precisely because that is a prevalent and allowable form of racism that is covered for at every level, because it goes along with the colonial wars, and the colonial wars go along with the interests of the finance capitalists in the city of London. So this is what we're facing. We're actually facing a tiny financial elite who are despoiling the earth and destroying the life of working people here. And to sew it all up, they find it very convenient to push this question of racism, to make racist slurs against immigrant parts of the working class, and to especially single out those parts of the working class who are increasingly awakened to an anti-imperialist line. And of course, in this context, we can't fail to mention the genocide that's happening in Gaza and the incredible revulsion that's caused amongst a huge section of the British working class. And again, the Tory administration felt desperately unhappy to have millions marching, literally millions, hundreds of thousands of millions marching week in, week out on the streets against their key colonial policy. And how do you repress it? You repress it by calling me a racist, calling you a racist, calling you a racist, calling me a terrorist, calling you a terrorist, calling you a terrorist, okay? So you take people who are giving a political message that helps you to understand it, you repress them, intimidate them, and try and intimidate people off the streets, but that didn't work. So what do? You increasingly turn to a different tactic, and you say, what about if we call them all Islamists, and this is Islamism on the street, and they're racists, and they're anti-Semites, and we've got to beat them off the streets, and they're intimidating a section of the population. No one wants to be a racist. God, I didn't know I was being a racist by saying that genocide's not a good thing. But this is the game that they're playing. So all of these narratives come together. Set up some pogroms, enforce them, crack down, but who are you cracking down on? You want to crack down on the working class to keep them in their place. So this is the reality, and Labour has a strong part. And you know, Labour's first few weeks in office have seen them say that they want to support unconditionally Zelensky. Last weekend, they literally went for permission to Joe Biden and the neocons in the United States and asked them for permission to fire Storm Shadow missiles, so British cruise missiles using US and British technology and oversight from Ukraine deep into Russia. So not enough that they're already on Kursk, fighting a second version of Nazi World War II tank battle that they're totally losing, which we can all applaud. But it's quite clear that the rise of the BRICS nation, their failure to win the Ukraine war is causing cracks in their imperialist alliance, cracks in their NATO military alliance, cracks in the European Union economy, cracks in the imperialist economy. Obviously, the massive escalation of gas prices that went along with sabotaging their own Nord Stream pipeline to Europe and wondering why the European economy is falling apart. All of this coupled, so it's a crisis of imperialism and their economy that's precipitating their increasingly mad actions, but their mad actions are impacting and accelerating the crisis, and that's very clear. So all of that is leading to a state of desperation. They're losing the war in Ukraine. They are teetering on nuclear conflict with Russia that could become global. It's definitely true. It's definitely true, at least to the extent it was in the 1960s Cuban Missile Crisis. And it definitely is not in our news. I mean, do you guys see it in the mainstream news that these things are happening? No, there's like mad denunciation of Russia and Putin and clique and more sanctions and more war. So Keir Starmer and David Lammy are 100% behind this. And the other thing they're 100% behind is Netanyahu and the genocide. I mean, I'm going to basically draw it to a close, but I just want to say that some of you should occasionally, if you don't already, watch the tweets and the feeds from David Lammy and Keir Starmer. I don't know if any of you saw that the Home Office put together this nauseating video. It was the Home Office. It had millions of views. By the time I saw it, it had 5 million views. I was one of the last to see it. But it had a deep impact on me. And it was there, sitting there going, I am the descendant of the enslaved peoples. And it's the honor of my life to serve as Home Secretary of State. I'm Foreign Secretary. I am representative of the people of Tottenham, and black people from working class, black people from Tottenham have never before risen to this position. It's just like, it nauseates me. It reminds me of what Claire Short said about the Irish when she was telling the Zimbabweans, we don't have to give you reparations of colonial, for land redistribution that we promised you, £1 billion, because I'm Irish and I know what it's like to be exploited. They must be there going, well, sorry, what's that got to do? What's that got to do with the Lancaster House Accords and the deal that we made with Margaret Thatcher in 1980? No, we don't have to honour that. A new administration come, break all your promises. New administration come, break all your promises. So here he is nauseatingly claiming to be the representative of the working people, but what he is precisely the opposite. He is the representative of British monopoly capital, of the City of London, of the Anglo-American imperialists, which is precisely why he's allying himself to fascists, actual fascists fighting a race war of supremacy, in Ukraine on behalf of Anglo-American capital to proxy war against Russia to destroy it and impose colonialism on the whole continent of Europe, and precisely why he's literally on his first day of office, he flew to shake the hand of Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, and all these absolute genocidal maniacs, who have an ethno-supremacist state designed, to be a permanent unsinkable aircraft carrier. We've seen just in the last few days, atrocity upon atrocity Israel commits. It's almost a year. In a couple of weeks' time, we're going to be demonstrating. It's 1 year that this genocide's going on. We salute the heroism, the self-sacrifice, the courage of the Palestinian people who have withstood that. And put themselves at the heart of the anti-imperialist struggle. But what we can see, I went on one of those early demonstrations, was speaking from a megaphone and saying, what we're going to see is the escalation of this into a wider regional conflict. And there's every sign that actually Anglo-American imperialism will be ejected from the Middle East. And I still think that that is true, despite their provocations against Iran, Hezbollah, the Yemenis. It's quite clear that the resistance forces in the Middle East are growing in maturity, in capability, and show every sign, despite this latest provocation of these exploding walkie-talkies, exploding pages, indiscriminate murder of so many people. And in Syria as well, in Lebanon and Syria. It's quite clear that this has not in any way lessened the ability, far from it, or the will of the resistance forces in the Middle East to fight against imperialism. We're seeing a time where there's a change in the balance of forces. There's a change in technological military power. There's a change in economic power. And it's because of that imperialism is weakening, that there's a crisis in the heartland of imperialism. Our job in the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, is to make absolutely sure that we do not allow charlatans within the left-wing movement to just push people back towards the Labour fold and say, just keep on doing the same old thing, but this time somehow it will be different. Labour Party is part of the problem. It's the representative imperialism, not just its leaders, top to bottom as an organisation, it is the problem. And anyone who says it's part of the solution and not part of the problem is themselves part of the problem. And we have to take that message.
Beautiful, thanks Ranjit. I'm anticipating that lots of people in the audience have got things they want to say at this point. I was hearing little noises all the way through of people agreeing with you or being sparked into thinking things, so I'm opening the floor to all of your
antidote for David Lammy is Bernie Grant.
Bernie Grant was your antidote.
That's the antidote.
Well, it's interesting, Bernie Grant went together with my father, interestingly, to Iraq. He used to come and speak at anti-imperialist meetings. So he was from the Labour school. He was a different breed, and he was the Tottenham MP that preceded David Lammy. But he used to come here. So I think Keith Rapal and Bernie Grant actually went on a mission to, and I might be getting it right, I'm fairly sure they went together to Iraq before the initial, was it 1999, before that war, when it was clear that that was happening. They went on a mission to essentially show solidarity and support, much as George Galloway did later on, I think before the 2003 war. So it wasn't obviously widely publicised here, but went on that mission. And he used to regularly come and speak at our meetings, and it was a proper anti-racist campaigner and fighter for the community in a way that you don't have figures like that within the Labour Party. So he was one of the very few people from the Labour Party who would come and speak with us, make common cause with us, and on certain issues around Palestine and around the anti-racist struggle. Was a very different beast, that's true.
But there's a fundamental problem, of course, which was that he still helped to perpetuate this illusion that somehow, through the Labour Party, we're going to get what we need. Yeah. And that was always the weakness of that position, because when you get a good person in Labour, that props up the myth much more effectively than 999,000 terrible people in Labour.
So what you're saying, Starmer is a good person to have?
Yeah. Starmer is the truth. Starmer is the exact true face of the Labour Party. And if everyone hates him, that's very good for the working class to understand.
But what's interesting is that people like, and I watch very carefully the Communist Party of Britain, because they still uphold an old tradition and an old programme which essentially says that the Labour Party will be the mass party of socialism, and we have to criticise the leaders but treat them like they're a separate party but that everyone else, apart from this very small leadership group, will be the answer. So we keep on engaging it, reform labour, reclaim labour. That's actually been going on since the First World War, since the first administration, certainly since the 20s. You know, they said the same thing about McDonald, Snowden, Henderson. So the very top leadership are the problem, and somehow they don't represent us, and we just reclaim it all. But it's a totally false notion. So that the whole Labour Party, you know, has been set up in a way. And interestingly, they come up with another proposal to reinforce that, where the parliamentary party becomes entirely divorced and not responsible to the entire membership apparatus. It really runs the Labour Party. And then there's an apparatus and machine around it. If you've seen Labour leaks and the way that the administration behave, they're the people who really run the Labour Party. And so the policy in government's got nothing to do with any rank and file members. And just to make sure that no figure like Corbyn should even hint at socialism from a leadership position, they are planning to set up something they call the Liz Truss clause. The Liz Truss clause is to make sure that the Labour Party membership never again have a vote on the leader. How's that the Liz Truss clause? Because they say that whole thing that when Liz Truss became, you know, elected because only the Tory Party membership voted for it. So the thing to do in the Labour Party is not to let the Labour Party membership vote for the leader. Yeah. So really, it's a way of making sure that there's never, an influx of people who try and displace the leadership in favour of anyone who might be less overtly capitalistic in their outlook.
I think they should have given Liz Truss a go. She only had about 5 minutes.
Creating their own grave diggers,
most probations lasted about 6 months.
Can I say something?
Yes.
This is really not new. I mean, I've been in the country since 2000. I remember after Tony Blair's war in Iraq, the Islamophobia that was being stopped. I will never forget that. I was quite shocked by it. And it was Labour that echoes and implements the most far-right rhetoric and policies. I mean, I remember the word, we have to protect British values. And I thought that was a Tory thing, like a nationalistic, you know, It was Labour that said it.
Yeah.
Right? We need to protect British values, our nation. And at the same time, they were introducing this draconian stop and search policies that were targeting black youth, Muslim students, women who were wearing the veil. I remember I was a teacher, I remember the education secretary who was saying, we have to absolutely stop families coming in this country who do not speak English.
It's funny.
They have to come and know English.
It's very interesting because I'm pretty old, and this was happening in '71. Exactly the same.
And it's always Labour that does the dirty job, because then Labour can always pose as the moral superiority. That's the one who is going to go to its workers and its controlled trade unions and tell them, keep the racists out. And this is exactly the campaign that they're running right now. They're trying to bring back people to Labour against the boogeyman of the far right. So consolidate Labour power, consolidate all the wars of plunder and distraction, and have the workers here afraid of the far right that's controlled by Labour, controlled by the British establishment, paid to do the dirty job. They know full well what they're doing, and then pose as the ones who are going to keep things democratic and inclusive.
Do you remember Gordon Brown?
Yeah.
His massive campaign was this British jobs for British workers.
British jobs for British
workers.
workers.
But every worker who's here is like a British worker, right? Like if you live in Britain, then you're British, and if you're not a capitalist, then you're a worker. But it was like he just had like lots of basically like white workers kind of campaigning that the job should preferentially come to us. It was like a massive thing that he did. But he could kind of claim to be pro-working class, but at the same time stoke this kind of semi-BNP crowd. And he had all these pictures. You still see them. If you have British jobs for British workers, you can see them on the internet. And it's all like they're got the Union Jack, and they're like, oh, God. give us the jobs. It was like a sectarian privilege for whites. You might as well have kind of campaigned for.
Yeah, I just want to say something that I was in Australia in times of the Iraq War. I'm Australian citizen as well, for my sins.
I'm so sorry.
Thank you. I mean that. And the amount of Islamophobia, it went through the roof. And I remember, because Australia just copycats Britain, poor women with hijab, what they suffered. Even I, non-practicing Muslim, not wearing hijab, because of my Middle Eastern face, I suffered like hell in the street, in bus, And I remember back then, also at work, I was sexually harassed. And I went to my, one of the volunteers, and I went to my boss, who was very left-leaning. And I said, Charlie, can I talk to you? And I said, this has happened. And he looked at me and said, is this because you're Muslim? And I thought, well, sexual harassment is the same for Anglo women, Muslim, Chinese, whoever. What I said was totally, I'm not going to talk about it, but it was quite sexual harassment. Close to being raped. And he said, because you're Muslim, you feel this is sexual harassment? And
Otherwise it would just be normal.
Yeah. If you were Anglo, civilized, Christian woman, no problem.
You'd realise it's fine.
You're making too much out of it. And I remember I'm really still thinking what poor Muslim women with hijab, they could say, obviously I'm not. But because of my Middle Eastern face, I suffered, man, amazingly. And even I remember in Australia has a very large Latin American communities who look like, and they suffered because of their look like Muslims and Middle Eastern.
Well, it's like that Brazilian tourist who was shot by the police in London, isn't it?
Yeah.
And their excuse was he looked like a terrorist.
Are you talking about John Charles de Menezes?
Yes.
He was actually a plumber in Stockholm.
It was just a Brazilian bloke who was like jumping his fare or something. He was running in a tube station.
Yeah, he was at home even. It was like he lived there, so he was at home. He went into the tube, but someone reported that he looked like a foreign, like a Pakistani, and like seven SO19 police shot him in the head in the tube in Stockholm.
Yeah. I remember that. Yeah. And his mother came and no compensation. Nothing.
No.
Fair game. Looking a bit Muslim. Well, it's fair enough, isn't it, really? But you're right, there's a level of propagandistic hysteria to create a mindset where the whole of society sort of accepts that. Oh, well, okay, yeah, well, it was an accident, but, he did look a bit Muslim. So it's a fair enough mistake to make, isn't it? He just shot. But the fact that he was shot before anybody even knew who he was, right? On the basis of, random tip, and that nobody really had anything to say about that.
Like this American Turkish.
Oh, is this a sign our society is going the wrong way? I wonder. No, well, just a mistake. These things happen. When you're at war with Islam.
I tend to shoot a lot now because it avoids paperwork, as much paperwork apparently I've heard, and like detaining people and all that. I've heard that a lot of the time they do just open fire, especially if it's just end the issue, and it's just really terrible, really. So I've heard that anyway. Whether it's specifically accurate, I'm not sure, because I've never been a police officer.
Seems more likely in America than here, but I don't know.
Yeah, I'm going to say.
It's going to
Get more prevalent here than when they're shooting people. Yeah.
It's war on terror. All this happened with the excuse of Iraq has weapons of mass destruction and we need to unleash war on terror. And now they're going to do it again. They're going to unleash war on racism, war on anti-democratic hate speech, and of course the target is going to be again the Muslim community, the people who are on pro-Palestine demos, and of course communists.
Well, I want to come back to that, if I may, because it's a really important point, that we have to understand that the target of these measures is us. If you look at the repression measures that Keir Starmer announced in the wake, allegedly, apparently in the wake of racist rioting, it was the need to clamp down on stifle and criminalise speech, basically. But the speech they're worried about is not racist speech, as Ranjit pointed out. They do that themselves all day, every day. The speech they're worried about is anti-Zionist speech, in particular, right now. They want to obstruct and criminalise. Here's our pamphlet about that. The book that we got arrested for having on a stall because this is hate speech, right? And when they talked about that, and when while the riots were sort of still ongoing, or as they were just starting to kind of crack down on them, there were policemen on the news saying, speech online also counts, we're going to come after you, don't think you can get away with hate speech anywhere, even if you're outside the country, we'll come after you. They were very, very threatening, but it was very noticeable they didn't say racist speech. They didn't say, if you're stirring up a racist pogrom, we're coming after you. They said hate speech. And hate speech was exactly what they called this when they arrested our people and raided their houses in the middle of the night. Hate speech, yeah, which can mean what you want it to mean, but we know that they're using it to target the Palestine movement. Obstruct and criminalise protest is the second thing they want to do. And we should notice in that context, not only the targeting of Palestine demonstrations that has already begun. In the last Palestine demonstration, they tried as much as they could to disrupt that, stop it from doing its usual routine thing in the central London, tried to change the time, tried to change the route, tried to disorganise it as much as possible. During those riots that happened in the summer, it was noticeable that they started changing their vocabulary. The politicians and media who were talking about what's happening started shifting from calling them riots to calling them protests. Why? Because what they want to do is clamp down on protest of all kinds. And in that respect, we should also notice what happened to the Just Stop Oil people. Now, it doesn't matter if you think their tactics were right, or even if you think their narrative is right, even if you think that they shouldn't be protesting at all, or what they're doing is all completely misguided, doesn't matter. What they did was cause a traffic jam, and what they got was 4 or 5 year prison sentences. Now, that is not about an environmental campaign. That's about the working class and its rising militants, and in particular, it's about the Palestine movement. You know, if you do something that disrupts our business in any way, you can go to jail. Right, so you put all these things together, and then, of course, the other measure that Starmer was talking about and trying to implement, and we'll have to see how far it goes in the near future, was this. He talked during the riots about keeping the courts open 24 hours. Swift justice. We have to overhaul the justice system, he told us. It's here. We have to overhaul the justice system. It's not fit for purpose because apparently it's not already a crime to set fire to a building full of people. We need new laws for that. No. What we need is new processes. It's too slow. We need to speed it all up. But what does it mean? He was keeping the courts open 24/7. Do you think that means people have the chance to assemble a case, get a proper defence? No. This is a speed them up and chuck them in jail process. It's the abolishing of due process. So all of that, to me, is aimed at the Palestine movement. If you look at their attempts to repress the Palestine movement, which have been going on now for a year, in each case, and we saw it with the case of Sarah Wilkinson, the journalist who was arrested recently with this huge anti-terror raid outside her house. And what's she doing? She's collecting information that other people have written that's already on the internet in one place and republishing it in a way that's quite handy for the people who know about her, which before her arrest, not that many people did. Right? But she created a kind of a news service about the genocide. That was it, from her little cottage in rural Shropshire. Right? She's living in a little village, and she's doing what we're told is our right to do, right? Use the internet, use social media, have your voice. Made a news channel, but you know she's a seasoned journalist. She's got connections to Gaza, and I think perhaps her connections to Gaza were part of what put her in the crosshairs, because the viciousness of the raid on her house had it sounds very Mossad. You know, the fact that it felt very personal, the things they did to her. You know, very vindictive, very violent, very brutal crackdown on an individual woman. Thank you. Yes, but anyway, my point. So they're cracking down on the Palestine movement. Oh, you lost my thread there.
The measures are not aimed.
Yeah, so what we have to recognise is that these measures, what they're really worried about is the Palestine movement. And the reason is, as the genocide has been continuing in the full glare of publicity in a way that can't be denied by major media or hidden, but for a variety of reasons, the core of the Palestine solidarity movement is becoming anti-imperialist in its consciousness and in its demands. And it's not under the control of the usual suspects in the way that the establishment is used to protest movements being. You can see that in a variety of ways. The fact that 4 or 5 MPs, what 4 really, were put into Parliament really on the back of that movement, you know, that is an expression of disgust with the status quo on a level that has not been seen in my lifetime. And the way that that was expressed electorally was quite significant. It's not so much about those individuals or whether they can do anything meaningful in Parliament, but the fact that the movement was at such a level of desire for change that it will break with the Labour Party, that Labour Party is being exposed through the genocide as much as the Tory Party. As Ranjit said in our analysis about the election showed, only 18% of British adults voted for this Labour government. They might have their landslide, they might have their majority to pass any law they want in Parliament without anyone getting in their way, which is useful for the ruling class. But the crisis of legitimacy is deep. And the Palestine movement is not going away. And it's frustrating the ruling class greatly that, okay, they have their usual suspects looking like the leadership of the movement and they're always there dominating the platform and all the rest of it and the logistics. But they didn't call that movement into being, and they can't dismiss it either. And the ruling class knows that, and they're worried about it. And what they want to do is intimidate it off the streets, because its core is anti-imperialist, because the genocide has been educating people about what Zionism really is in a way that they never got it before. A lot of people in the Palestine solidarity movement just used to feel sorry for Palestinians. It's kind of unfair. But they didn't necessarily go further than that, the majority of them. And it all seemed very intractable, and, you know, two-state solutions seemed kind of reasonable, and they couldn't quite get why it never worked out, and Hamas always seemed a bit beyond the pale, you know, and all of that. Well, armed resistance is, you know, most of the Palestine solidarity movement would have agreed with the British establishment that the resistance were terrorists, and, you know, but the genocide has exposed many, many of these myths. And the analysis we have, which we always had, our analysis of Zionism and the role it plays and of the resistance and why it's justified, is older than our party, right? But the willingness of people to receive this information, their interest in it, their questing for this information, the number of people who've been spurred by what they've seen to go out actively and look for information. What is this Israel? What is this Zionism? How did it get there? Who backs it? Why? And so at the core of the Palestine solidarity movement is an anti-imperialist sentiment, which is growing. And that is a great threat to the imperialists. You know, holding on to the Zionist colony is a major, major goal for them. To lose their ability to loot Middle Eastern oil will be absolutely catastrophic for imperialism. And it's a catastrophe they're staring in the face right now, because the balance of forces in the Middle East has shifted decisively. You can see that. Anybody with a brain can see that. But because they are impelled by the logic of their system, they can't look and say, oh, well, we should just back off now because we can't win this battle. They can't do that, because that admits that they are going to lose the right to be the imperialists. Without the ability to keep exploiting, as Ranjit said, without the acquiescence of all of the looted peoples of the globe is what's necessary for the lords of finance capital to retain their place. And that requires constant reinforcement. And oil, of course, is the commodity of commodities. And that makes the Middle East of pivotal importance, you know, and keeping the resistance, keeping the national liberation of the Arab and Middle Eastern people down has been a primary geopolitical goal of Western imperialism, you know, for more than 100 years. But that is clearly coming to an end. And the Palestine solidarity movement is really the section of British population that's like starting to recognise that. Is there anybody else in the... Well, I'm sure there's more of you who want to say things in this meeting before I come back to Egypt. Yes.
Andrew.
I think that really all worked out question just about the ICJ, you know, and the recent increasingly strong pronunciations against Israel, saying you must stop it, you must allow them to come back to Palestine, you must do this, that and the other, which they're never going to do. But they're just powerless, right? They're toothless, and every time all the usual suspects veto it, and yet they're still managing to get to vote through these very impressive resolutions. You know. So well, that's, I'm just wondering if you think that perhaps the United Nations is more sort of retrievable than the Labour Party. You know, you were just saying that the Labour Party, everyone think that's the answer. You've got to resurrect it somehow. And the United Nations, you know, it's like the international, the ICJ is this top level of cruelty in the world, which is just being ignored. Geneva Convention, everything, you know, means nothing. And I just wondered if you have any sort of worked out ideas on or just how hopeful are you that they might get more power in the future? That, you know, maybe, for instance, getting rid of the veto from the United Nations.
It's a very good question. You know, I'm not going to answer that straight away myself. I'm going to throw it open to our audience. What do people think about that?
I think the BRICS might take it over. I do, because the BRICS seems to be developing and they're being pushed now. They're being pushed to. And it's not just BRICS anymore. It's BRICS Plus. And there's people lining up to get into this group.
Yeah.
But the people that are in BRICS, some of those people are in the United Nations. And in the United Nations, they're talking about Africa having a vote in BRICS. So there's in the United Nations, because Africa hasn't got a vote.
In the Security Council.
In the Security Council.
Yeah.
So they haven't, and they're talking about that. So it could be sort of like, you know what, let's take this organisation which is already running and basically just say to America, you're out. And just like, let's be back again and then go for it. Because now you've got, I mean, this thing going on in Ukraine, right, it's just shown NATO's kind of like a toothless tiger. China's not even started yet. And Africa is sort of like, wait, you know, there's countries in Africa looking around and saying, you know what, we've had enough of this as well. So I don't know. It might be. I'm thinking it might be that they'll just take that whole organisation and just like you said, sort out the veto and just take the whole thing over. I don't know.
That's it. Yeah, it's not. I don't think it's a scenario that you're the only person who's thought along those lines. Welcome, Chris. Come on in. George, you look like you were thinking something. No? You don't have anything to say?
it looks like Greeks all become very popular. Even Turkey, member of NATO, wants to join Brussels. Gave me a very good laugh.
Erdogan, we must say, whatever you think about President Erdogan, he is nothing if not a survivor. And he's not an idiot. You might not like the guy, but as somebody who's accustomed to trying to face in three directions at once, I think he's someone who's watching which way the wind is blowing and trying to see if there's a way for him and his establishment to survive what's coming.
Once he's been rejected because the membership of NATO, because they can't come to BRICS. Like,
It would be interesting.
Enjoy both of the both worlds.
I mean, personally, when I look at, just to come back to Berry's question about the United Nations, I think you see several things at play. When you look at the ICJ verdict, what you're seeing is the pressure of world public opinion, that simply the facts are too clear to be denied, and if you don't reflect them, you're declaring your bankruptcy outright. But then, having reflected them, the fact that nothing can be implemented of your decision, because the United States holds, in fact, the only meaningful power in the United Nations, that becomes exposed before the world also. So along with trying to save the reputation of the United Nations by passing the verdict, but then losing the reputation of the United Nations, in fact, because nothing can be implemented, the only enforcer of decisions in the UN is the USA. Right? The only enforcement mechanism is the Security Council, and anything that comes that's actually implemented by the Security Council has to go through the USA's veto. Ergo, the United Nations sits in New York, right? Is physically controlled. Like, who gets to come and speak at the UN is physically gatekeepered by the USA. If they decide your country's not sending anyone, your country's not sending anyone. So they physically control it. They financially are the biggest contributor and are in a position, because everybody who works at the UN lives in New York. They have all kinds of mechanisms for controlling delegates, which every now and again you hear about, the pressures that are brought to bear on different people who work there in different situations. So this is being exposed. And I think the exposure of the UN's role as essentially the colonial office of the USA, as United States Imperialism, as my dad used to call it, is one of the drivers of this new world order that we see rising. The fact that there are parallel institutions are being set up at an increasingly accelerated rate from a very kind of cautious beginning. There's an increasing sense by the rest of the world that if they want to get anything done for themselves in a just, equitable way that serves them and not the imperialists, they're going to have to do it separately. And I think what's likely to happen personally is that they will end up being bypassed. People will give up this idea of trying to reclaim the UN, and that's my view. I don't know. It's just a guess. It's just a guess. Yeah, but I think the likelihood is, I feel that a lot of the pressure now, these days, on the UN, that's done diplomatically, is more about trying to get people to notice what's wrong with the UN than it is a real, genuine sense that you're going to fix it.
This has been a problem for a long time, hasn't it? The entire way that the UN was set up was a reflection of the balance of forces at the time it was set up. And it was overwhelmingly the domination of the imperial powers. There's no justification, even a Security Council. Who was the original Security Council? Britain, which was there not because of the size of its own population, but because of its financial might and the strength of its colonies. It spoke for India, spoke for Kenya, spoke for South Africa, etc., etc., etc. Britain. France, again, because it spoke for all the colonial people. So these were the huge powers. USA, because it was the new imperialist power, and increasingly has become now the strongest, because through World War I and World War II it undermined and took the others under its wing. And then China, when China was initially given a seat, who did they put there? They put Taiwan, because the US were very much involved in subverting the real liberation struggle and the communist struggle. They championed the reactionary right comprador regime of the Kuomintang of Chiang Kai-shek. And when they ultimately lost that civil war, they removed his government onto the province of Taiwan, which is a province of China, And since that time, which was briefly occupied by Japan even before then, and since that time, they recognized that right up until the 1970s as being the real Republic of China. So they called it the Republic of China. They set up their regime there. It had a very small population. You know, you got, at the time, I think there were like 400 million Chinese. Now they're obviously 1.4 billion. But they still recognized their little island of Taiwan as being the legitimate government. And so their stooge sat there. So it was another vote for USA on the Security Council. And the only one there was the USSR, because they couldn't any longer be ignored, having defeated, Hitlerite Germany. And so if the USSR vetoed things, then it just stopped the whole mechanism from working, and US withdrew from it. The one time when USSR walked out of deliberations was the time for the Korean War. So the Korean War was a UN war, because the USSR walked away and didn't vote on it, right? So that was Vietnam wasn't. So every time that the US couldn't get its way through the UN, it just ignored it. Like Iraq War. Iraq War wasn't a UN war. There was a little bit of debate. Tony Benn's big thing was, I remember it was amazing to me. George Galloway still says he's a Bennite, but Tony Benn, I remember seeing him in a demonstration in Trafalgar Square before the outbreak of the first Gulf War. So it must have been
No, before the second, sure.
It was the first? Oh, no, you're right, it was before the second. So it was 2002, about 2002. And we were talking about whether or not we should have another war, and he was like, war's absolutely wrong, because sanctions haven't run their course. It's like, oh wow, but we just, 500,000 babies have died, and Madeleine Albright says that's fine, and you basically agree, we shouldn't have war, carry on with the sanctions, just keep killing the babies through the sanctions. It's a much better way, food for oil. And Kofi Annan's son even was involved in the scandal around that, right? So you nickel their wealth, and then you feed them a few grains, and you say, well, it's a fair exchange. There's food for oil. We'll starve you, we'll just give you bare sanctions relief and steal your entire national wealth. And everyone involved in that administration has the ability to loot it. So they did that. But that, of course, some of the European powers, including France, were not in favour of it. So they couldn't get the UN to vote for it. But the other thing Labour said was, we should have a UN vote. The left wing of Labour, we should have a UN vote. Tony Blair, no, I've got my great moral conviction. God has spoken to me. It's come down from heaven, and I'm absolutely convinced it's the right thing to do. We've got to get rid of this dictator. But that's basically what it was. They went around the entire mechanism of international law and had a coalition of the willing, right? Coalition of the willing, where does that come from? It's like the rules-based international order. If you can't make actual international law for you, you make up your own rules. But it's the same. So UN works to the extent that it reflects the interests of US imperialism. When the Soviet Union vetoed it, they ignored it, didn't pay their contributions, pretended it wasn't there, did their own thing. And then it was the Cold War and battle against the evil empire. When the Soviet Union fell, they recolonized it, and now it's a really useful mechanism for getting what we want. And for a long time, China felt very on the back foot. They didn't feel able to veto and play a big role in international politics. They were just coming up, they're developing their industry. Now they feel differently. But the UN is useful to the extent US can use it. And so the ICJ can pass the verdict. It's impossible to deny the evidence. When the foreign minister of Israel, or the minister of war comes on and says, the Palestinians are human animals, and we must treat them as such. When they give biblical references to that Amalek, which we wipe them out. Wipe out their children, wipe out their animals, kill, not leave an ox stand. This is the biblical. So they're openly preaching genocide whilst they're committing genocide. They're telling Palestinians, go from the north. North is not safe. Oh, now the middle's not safe. Go to the south. No, go to the southwest little corner on the beach, and then you bomb them there as well. So you systematically chase them, and you're openly saying, we're going to open the borders and force them into Egypt. So you're literally preaching genocide, committing genocide. US and Britain are giving the weapons for genocide, and then comes to your court, and then how can you deny it genocide? Where's genocide? It's obviously genocide. So they said it's genocide, but then what happens? Well, you carry on, US giving the weapons, carry on, Britain giving the weapons, Labour Party giving the weapons, Keir Starmer, David Lammy, Rachel, they all are absolute supporters of this genocide, and they're supporters of it not even because of racism. Racism is a useful tool that they use. Because they want the oil wealth of the Middle East, they want the right to exploit the peoples of the Middle East, and they want their colonial order to stay in place. But this deeply exposes the whole colonial basis of the modern relations of the Middle East, and it means the Arab street, as we like to call it, the mass of the people in the regimes like Jordan, like Egypt, like Saudi, like the Gulf states. Mass of people in the Gulf states, of course, is wrong. They're all Pakistani. But all of these people are deeply angry and hostile. Israel is being kept afloat by alternative truck routes which are coming through the royal kingdom of Jordan. All their vegetables, all their supplies are coming there. There was that incident the other day where one of the truckers, it turns out, was a descendant of a previous general who'd fought the Israelis. So clearly there's very strong nationalist sentiments that do run throughout those populations. And then not just the Palestinian section, which is half the bloody population of Jordan anyway, they got out and shot some Israeli guards, right? Yeah. And as a result, they've almost kind of cut themselves off from that supply line as well. So Israel's in a very deep crisis. It's in an existential crisis. And frankly, that's the most positive thing to come out of this whole conflict.
The thing about court, I mean, if a court without teeth, I mean, if a judge sentences, says, Barry, you've got to go to prison, and I go, what? I'm out here. What normally happens, they don't get the police come down, hold me, and they basically cut me off. The ICJ, who's going to do that? Because without that, a court is useless. Yes. Right? So who's going to do that? Who's going to do that?
Exactly, and that's basically, isn't it? So what you see is it's not a United Nations at all. There's a deep class struggle which is going on in international form, and the people who are currently running the show are the biggest gangsters on the block, right? So they're only ever going to enforce their own interests and their own will. So there will in the future be some international body. But when the actual countries are run by the working people themselves, it'll be a very different body and character to what it is now. And I doubt very much it will be called. We'll have to think of a different name for it. United Soviet, something. We'll find a name. But
Peter.
It's on a different aspect of Ranjit's presentation, for which many thanks. You mentioned the miners' strike, without wanting to be too retrospective, as somebody who lived through it, I was kind of quite incredulous at the time that Kinnock sort of distanced himself from the miners, and also the TUC General Secretary, Norman Willis, also wouldn't march with them. And that to me was the sort of definitive moment when Labour lost all credibility for me personally. Interestingly, during that time, 1984, despite the lack of endorsement or support from Labour leadership, there was a huge international groundswell of support. And one that I remember very well, most economically and in sort of terms of just encouragement, was the miners in the Donbass. Yes, were one of the main supporters, and so it kind of. It forced me to kind of realign my political thinking.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think the entire Soviet trade union, which basically was therefore the entire Soviet workforce, gave up like half a day's pay, and they sent something. Maybe it was even a few minutes' pay because it was the whole nation. But they offered to send millions of pounds, and they tried to do it via the Trade Union Congress, and the Trade Union Congress turned them down.
Said no.
Said very directly turned them down. While miners' children were starving, and the Soviet workers were trying to send them aid and solidarity, and they made a great show of saying, "Oh no, we don't want this kind of outside interference and
dirty money
communist interference in our democracy," and they turned it down. So this is the dirty role of our so-called trades union Congress leadership.
That's absolutely right, and you're right, Peter. The Donbass miners throughout did give a lot of support to the miners, very directly. Is it okay if I do a few closing words then? Were anybody else? Is that okay with you?
It's fine with me.
Did you have something else you wanted to put in? Okay, I'm going to do a little closing round.
Maybe say that I'm aware that my unstructured speech was a little negative. But I just do want to point out that this moment that we're living in gives us a great positive opportunity. A positive opportunity because just as this room reflects, yes, some old comrades, but also many people who are new and people we've never met before, more and more people are finding resonance and some meaning and understanding in the message that we're giving, not because it's rocket science, but because their life's experience is chiming in with the truth that's contained in our message. And so our job now is to recognize that moment and to build us, not just into a moral force, but a positive organizational political force. It means a little bit more effort on our part. It means joining if you've not joined. It means becoming a supporter if you're not a supporter, stepping up your activity, having little practical activities, stalls, street stalls, tending demonstrations, reaching out, getting other people into membership, coming to study class, using all of our creative knowledge experience to build an organization which can start to make this understanding imprint itself and reach out to the most militant sections, the most far-sighted sections of the British working class, of all nationalities, colours, backgrounds, religions. We are uniting people on the basis of their economic interest, which is to build a totally different society that will get rid of the absurdities that we're facing, and we will overcome these what will seem absurd problems. We'll put capitalism in the museum alongside the Bronze Age axe and the old-fashioned spinning wheel, and we'll build a very different society. Everything necessary for the building of that new society and a really bright and happy world is present. And this is our moment, I think, to grasp it, and we must recognize that real positive opportunity in what can seem like a sea of overwhelming despair. All right, so I really want you to take that and help us build the organization.
Now, while that was a really good note to end on, I did want to just underline a couple of things before we all go away again. So the first one was really just a simple thing, coming back to our question of migration and immigration, and in particular refugees, who were the ones who were the most scapegoated and vilified by the propaganda in our country, and who the politicians love to target and point at and refer to as floods and hordes and, like they're insects or animals or, some kind of force of nature that's threatening to overwhelm you or invade you. The truth is that the majority of the refugees caused by imperialist wars actually end up quite close to home. And for all that we get a constant trickle, the real flood is elsewhere. The vast majority of refugees from the Iraq War used to be in Syria until they were displaced again by the Syria war. Many Middle Eastern refugees right now are in Lebanon. Lebanon's a tiny place. And there it really is genuinely destabilizing. The huge influx of refugees, an infrastructure that really can't handle it, and they become an absolutely hyper-exploitable force. Even more so than here in terms of the conditions that can be forced upon, desperate people in desperate conditions. So we have to also put this whole narrative in some context. It's our rulers who create these problems. Workers in the West have lived a privileged existence off the back of the misery of the people in the rest of the world. The numbers that come here are entirely manageable, in fact, not remotely overwhelming, not remotely more than the wealth of our country or the infrastructure can handle. The way they're handled is deliberately provocative. But we shouldn't, be confused about these numbers games that people try to play. Or this fact that, now it's becoming overwhelmed. Now it's gone a tipping point. Before it wasn't so bad, but now it's terrible. It's all total nonsense. It's about just dividing us and making us stupid. And on that question, when it comes to racism, and of course these questions are intimately, connected, racism fundamentally is not actually connected with skin colour. Now that sounds like a funny thing to say in Britain today. We feel like our experience of racism has been against black people. But it's not about skin colour fundamentally, it's about imperialism. It's about colonial subjugation and exploitation. And actually the target of the time, the target of the era shifts. All of the colonial practices that were used across the British Empire at various times against various peoples were practiced first on the Irish. And Ireland was the first vilified section of the population in Britain. And if you read the works of Marx and Engels, they repeatedly refer to this great divide in the working class and how it kept the working class stupid, backward, divided, malleable to the ruling class, how important it was for the continued rule of British capital to have the workers fighting one another. That has never changed. And if you look at how intimately connected racism and imperialism are, you see that on the one hand, racism is used, like the Islamophobia we've seen in the last 20 years, to justify wars abroad to the home population. So you don't say we're going to nick their oil, a la Donald Trump. You say we're going to liberate the people from their awful dictators, and also, by the way, they've got this weird religion and they're lunatics, and they bombed the towers, and they did 7th of October. They're coming to get you because they're Islamists, because they believe in this religion that tells them to kill everybody. That's what jihad means. Jihad doesn't mean that. Jihad means struggle. I mean, it's like, but they just tell you a bunch of things endlessly, hammer your head with them. And so on the one hand, they justify their wars abroad, and on the other hand, they keep workers at home divided against one another. And both of these are key to the survival of the imperialist system, absolutely key. They can't work without it. So if you truly want to abolish racism, if you truly want to stop all this hate speech, it's imperialism's got to be your target, not another section of the working class. And then just finally, just a kind of overall thought about what we're doing here, because there's a famous quote from Chairman Mao where he used to talk about seeking truth from facts. Well, a lot of people have misused that quote, and they'll point to things, surface phenomena, and that's a fact. You can call anything a fact that seems like it's kind of commonsensely true. But Marxism seeks the truth from facts, but in a deeper way, because Marxist science helps you to understand the forces that act below the surface, that explain the surface phenomenon. Don't just point to surface phenomena and go, look, there's a lot of people there that didn't used to be there. No, look at it in its context, in its motion, its historical development. What's it really mean? And in particular, what class interests are at play behind those forces. Because our job is not just to explain what we're looking at. Our job is to understand that for humanity to liberate itself, for humanity to actually liberate the productive forces it has created and actually use them to benefit humankind, we have to get from capitalist imperialism to socialism. That's what Marxism teaches us irrefutably. That's why it's such a powerful weapon in our hands. That's why the ruling class wants us not to know about it or use it or go anywhere near it. That's why they endlessly tell you capital's too hard for a worker to read, because they don't want you to know what's in it. They want to stop you at the first hurdle. Because when we get the big picture and how things fit into that, the fact that workers need socialism, and that's got to be the end point of all our activity, not just running around in circles against this thing and this thing and this thing and this thing. We've got to stop being distracted by all the surface phenomena. We've got to understand what's going on underneath, that there's a class war going on, that ultimately it's a clash of two systems, that the new system and that everything we need, as Ranjit said, to create the new system exists within the old, but the barriers of the old system have to be broken in order for the workers and the means of production to come together and be set free. Once we understand those things, that big picture, then we can start to make policies about the things that fit inside that. But our policy has to be based on that, based on using a Marxist analysis to find out what will empower the workers in that struggle for socialism, right? It's not just what's popular or what seems to fit this thing taken in isolation from all the rest. As soon as you start breaking things, isolating them, you're blind. You have to first understand the big picture and then look at how the smaller things fit into them and not the other way around. That's the power of Marxist dialectical thinking that makes Marxists seem so clever compared to all these intellectuals who are so stunted. All these genius intellectuals that the West produces. You can listen to people, they're so knowledgeable, they know, but yet they come up against this hard barrier of their lack, their lack of Marxist understanding, their lack of dialectical thinking, their lack of understanding of the big picture of the class forces of society or of history, actually. And they come up constantly against this viewpoint that somehow it's to do with individuals or looking at things in isolation, you know, and they don't even know they're doing it, and they don't realize how their cleverness suddenly becomes stupid when they hit this barrier. And as you say, you get people like, you know, Alexander Mercouris of the Duran. If you're watching, sorry, Alexander, I find you extremely intelligent and interesting, but the endless repetition of the mantra that, you know, the neocons are just weird people with no reverse gear is painful. You know, there's something lacking, and it's dialectical analysis that creates stupidity out of intelligence and hamstrings us. It's absolutely, it's a handicap on the working class to be denied this vision, that why we have a communist party, to give leadership to the working class, is not because we're like, oh, we should be your leaders. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is the working class, to organise in its own interest, must be guided by this science. And to be guided by this science, which is its liberation ideology, it needs an organised party whose job is to train Marxists, worker theoreticians. It doesn't matter what background you come from, you can become a working class theoretician if you want to, if you're ready to. Our party's job, a communist party's job, is to create this guiding force of the working class, which can harness its power, its energy, its anger in a constructive way to actually win the battle that needs to be won. And when we look at any particular question, it has to be in that context. If we don't look at the big picture, if we don't take the long-term view, if we don't fit things into the bigger arc of history, if we don't fit them into the larger mission of winning the battle for socialism, we will lose not only the big battle, but all the small ones along the way. And as Ranjit said, just to finish up, you know, our time is coming. You can feel the shift in the balance of forces in the world. You can feel the desire of the workers to break free. You can feel the desire of the oppressed peoples to break free. You can feel the panic of the imperialists as their economic crisis deepens, which it is deepening every day more. They are in dire straits. Their whole system is 100 years past its sell-by date, and it's showing in a million different ways. But, as many people have said, a dying beast is a dangerous beast. Definitely the coming period is a period when victory can be won, but it won't be won without serious organisation and struggle.
Excellent.